All right, we're going to talk Chapter 5, the colonization of the Americas from the point of view of the Spanish. So one thing to think about is why were Western European countries exploring the Pacific Ocean? Well, one of the major reasons is they already had established trade routes with Indochina and in the countries India and China and Southeast Asia. However, in 1683, you have the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Actually happens well before 1683 in the mid-1400s. And as a result, there's no longer the trade routes that the Western European countries can follow in order to reach India and China. As a result, they turn to other ways. So the Portuguese, they go south. As a result, Brazil and some countries in the southern part of Africa are Portuguese speaking today. The Spanish go west. English, French go west. Dutch, they go around, and the Dutch get a lot of establishments in the East Indies as well. But one thing to really think about is the story of Christopher Columbus highlights the importance that we have in terms of mercantilism. Is he goes to the kings and queens of several different countries to receive one of these charters to be able to go, that they finance his trip so he can go. And that highlights this notion of mercantilism, that the merchant stands to benefit and is willing to take those risks. Finally, he gains acceptance with Queen Isabella of Spain. She sells her family, her royal jewelry to be able to finance and fund his trip. Columbus gets to keep 10% of everything he finds in the New World from the new trade routes, and everything else goes to the king and queen. He goes west seeking for India and China, but he finds a different continent. And so as the Spanish now discover the Americas, the real question we want to think about is what are the strategies that they used for the colonization? And their strategies can be summarized with these three key points. First is they do their best to capture the local leader. They would use him to be able to control the native populations and then do further actions to control the native populations, all with the exact goal of to extract resources, was to take the resources found in those countries and to use them to enrich Spain. So let's look at the first example. And there's several examples. We're just going to focus on Hernan Cortez. So Hernan Cortez shows up in Mexico. You have the Aztec Emperor Montezuma. And what happens is they show up and they fire off their guns. The Aztecs were enthralled. They did not know what these were, but it drew great fear upon them. At that point, Montezuma is seized. They control him. They then they take him to the storehouse, and they show the great gold and treasures they have. The Spaniards throw away the feathers and all the things that weren't important to them, and they burn and melt all the gold, and they realize that the Aztec Empire is full of gold. And that leads then to the capture of Montezuma and trying to subjugate the natives and then to extract those resources. And so to do this, within 2 years, the Spanish, who are completely outnumbered, conquer the Aztec nation. And they divide the land into a system known as encomiendas. And so an encomienda comes from the Spanish word to entrust. Right? And so these people were entrusted, Spaniards were entrusted of the land, and they were there to take care of the land and the people on the land, and to use those people to extract resources. And those would then be given to the conquistadores, who would then send it back to Spain to enrich the mother country. In a book, Why Nations Fail, by Doron Asamoglu and James Robinson, he talk about what leads to countries to fail today and what leads countries to succeed today. So an extension of what Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And they talk about the establishment of two types of institutions, extractive institutions and inclusive institutions. The purpose of an extractive institution was to extract resources, extract wealth, and give it to those that are in power. An inclusive institution is to include the people in the enrichment and to give the people the power to be able to be wealthy. And so they talk about and they argue that because of path dependency, the differences we see in countries today is based off of actions taken during the colonization of the Americas, specifically the extractive institutions like the encomienda system that the Spanish adopted. One of my favorite stories is Pedro de Valdivia, the founder of Santiago de Chile. He was captured by the locals, Mapuches. He was looking for gold, and they said to satisfy his thirst for gold, they poured molten gold down his throat, and thus ended the days of Pedro de Valdivia. So great legends of how he died. This is by far my favorite one, that the molten gold gave him what he wanted most. In the book, they talk about, in The Wealth of Nations, or Why Nations Fell, they talk about the history of Mexico. And they talk about these times where Mexico has gone through revolutions. And what they do when they go through these revolutions is they're exchanging one extractive institution for another. So originally they were set up under the Spanish rule. In 1808, Napoleon of France conquers Spain. So they now have a new king. Ferdinand VII regains control of Spain. So 7 years later, you now have a new king. In 1821, Mexico gains independence from Spain. But just a year later, Agustin de Iturbide becomes a dictator. Rather than having an extractive institution by Spain, we now have a local extractive institution. Between 1824 and 1867, Mexico had 52 different presidents. It's a time of great revolution, of continuous political instability. Santa Anna was president 11 different times during that time frame. Even afterwards, in 1876, Porfirio Diaz becomes the president, and he begins to violate property rights. He takes private property and gives it to those people who are loyal to him. He grants monopolies to his supporters in business and banking. And what the book argues, and there's some great examples, I encourage you, again, part of the class is to read that first chapter, is throughout Latin America, not just in Mexico, but throughout Latin America, the 1900s were a time period of revolution, of evolving institutions, but what it really is changing one type of extractive institution for another. And Carlos Slim is the example used in the sense that he gains monopoly power of the telecommunication company throughout all of Mexico. The government does the best to protect his monopoly rights. He becomes the 5th richest man in the world and the richest in all of Latin America. And this is an example of continuation of extractive institutions, even today, which the book argues leads to why some nations are wealthier than others. Speaking of books, you want a book recommendation? Here's a great book that talks about the founding of the Americas, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it talks about specifically what led to the death of a lot of people within the Americas. Now, they talk more than just the Americas, but in this, it turns out guns and steel were not the most deadly tool that the Spaniards brought with them, or that the Europeans brought with them. It was germs. Germs killed 95% of the population. That's why when Meriwether Lewis and Clark go west to the Oregon Territory, what they find is not a lot of people, because they've already been decimated 100 years earlier by diseases brought by the Spaniards. So to summarize, chapter 5 is this idea of how the Spanish colonized the Americas. And again, it's that 3-step process: capture the leader, subjugate the native, extract resources. The whole purpose of mercantilism within the founding of the Spanish colonies was to extract resources, to take out the gold and silver and enrich the king and queen of Spain. And next, we're going to talk about the English colonies and juxtapose those two and how they differ.